Have you ever had a moment where your gut just screams at you to turn around, but your brain, that logical, stubborn part of you, just laughs it off? Why do we do that? Why do we ignore the millions of years of evolution telling us we are being hunted? I spent my life under the hoods of rusted out trucks in Poughkeepsie, dealing with things I can see, touch, and fix with a wrench. But what happened in the North Woods of Maine, that's a break in the machine I can't fix. It was mid-October, and the air was crisp, smelling of damp cedar and dying leaves. My wife Sarah and our son Leo were finally on board for a week-long getaway at a remote cabin I'd rented near the Allagash wilderness. Even Barnaby, our big, goofy golden retriever, seemed hyped, his head hanging out the truck window the whole drive up. It's about a 7-hour haul from Poughkeepsie if you don't hit traffic, and by the time the asphalt turned to gravel and the gravel turned to dirt, the sun was a bruised purple behind the pines. I remember looking at the map and thinking how empty the space was. Miles of nothing but timber and water. We pulled up to the cabin, a sturdy little place made of notched logs, nestled in a clearing that felt like it was being swallowed by the forest. The weather was eerily calm, not a breath of wind to stir the crimson maples, yet there was this heaviness in the air, like the atmosphere was holding its breath. As I killed the engine, the silence that rushed in wasn't peaceful. It was absolute. No birds, no crickets, just the clicking of the cooling manifold and the sound of my own heartbeat. Barnaby didn't jump out like he usually does. He stayed in the back seat, a low, vibrato rumble starting in his chest that I'd never heard before. "What's up, Barnaby? You smell a squirrel?" Leo asked, patting the dog's head. But Barnaby's eyes were fixed in the dense tree line to the north. Sarah laughed it off, blaming the long car ride. But I felt that first cold needle of dread prick my spine. Why was the forest so quiet? Where were the sounds of the Maine's autumn we'd come for? We spent the first hour unpacking by headlamp, the beams of light cutting through darkness that felt thicker than it should have been. I'm a hiker. I've been all over the Catskills and the Adirondacks, so I know the woods, but this felt different. It felt like we were trespassing in a place that had forgotten people existed. After dinner, I stepped out onto the porch to finish a beer and watch the stars. That's when I heard it. Not a howl, not a growl, but a sound like a heavy branch snapping, deliberate and loud, followed by a huff of air that sounded like a bellows. It came from the shadows just past the fire pit. I clicked on my high-lumen flashlight, the one I keep in the truck for night calls, and swept the beam across the brush. For a split second, 2 amber orbs caught the light, reflecting back with a predatory intensity that froze the blood in my veins. They were too high off the ground to be a wolf, too wide apart to be a bear. Then they simply blinked and vanished into the dark. I stood on that porch for what felt like an hour, the heavy maglite trembling slightly in my hand. You know that feeling when you're working under a car and the jack slips a fraction of an inch? That instant spike of, oh no, that was my entire body in that moment. I didn't tell Sarah or Leo what I saw. I didn't want to ruin the first night of the trip with what I hoped was just a stray black bear. But I made sure the heavy deadbolt on the cabin door was thrown, and I kept my 9mm within arm's reach on the nightstand. Sleep didn't come easy. Every time the cabin groaned under the cooling night air, I was wide awake, straining my ears. Around 3 a.m., Barnaby started pacing. He wasn't barking, which was weirder. He was making his high-pitched whining sound, pacing from the door to the window and back again. I got up, moved to the kitchen window that faced the rear woods, and peered out. The moon was a sliver, but the starlight was bright enough to illuminate the silver-gray silhouettes of the pines. There, standing by the wood pile I'd used earlier, was a shape. At first I thought it was a stump, but then the stump unfolded. It rose up on 2 legs, stretching higher and higher until it had to be 7, maybe 8 feet tall. It wasn't a bear. The silhouette was all wrong. Powerful limbs, a deep chest, and a head that looked like a nightmare version of a German shepherd, complete with pointed, upright ears. It just stood there, perfectly still, looking at the cabin. My breath fogged the glass, and for a second I thought it saw me. It turned its head with a jerky canine movement, sniffing the air with a muzzle that looked far too long for a man, yet it stood with a terrifyingly human posture. I've read the stories, the Dogman encounters people whisper about on forums, but being a mechanic from Poughkeepsie, you don't believe in fairy tales until one is looking at your house. It let out a low, guttural vibration that I felt in my teeth more than I heard it with my ears. Then, with a speed that defied its size, it dropped to all fours and vanished into the tree line with a series of heavy, rhythmic thuds. The forest went back to that suffocating silence. The next morning, the calm weather felt like a trap. The sun was out, but the woods felt crowded, like the trees were leaning in to listen to us. Sarah noticed I was off. "Silvester, you're pale. Did the coffee not kick in?" she asked, trying to be light-hearted while she flipped pancakes. I just nodded and suggested we stay close to the cabin today. I went outside under the guise of checking the truck's tires, but I really wanted to see the wood pile. There, in the soft, damp earth, were tracks. They weren't bare paws. They were massive, elongated prints with deep claw marks at the tips. And the stride, if this thing was walking on 2 legs, was nearly 5 feet apart. My stomach did a slow roll. This wasn't just an encounter. We were being watched by something that shouldn't exist. I looked back at the cabin, seeing Leo playing with Barnaby on the porch, and realized we weren't in a vacation spot anymore. We were in a cage. By noon, the sky turned a dull, leaded gray, and the wind finally picked up, whistling through the leaves like a low flute. I spent the morning organizing my gear, which really meant checking the action on my 9mm and making sure my heavy-duty failing axe was sharp and accessible. Sarah wanted to go for a hike down to the lake, but I put my foot down, claiming my old knee injury from the shop was acting up. "We are in the middle of paradise, Silvester, and you want to sit on the porch?" She sighed, though I could tell she felt the tension radiating off me. To keep them occupied, we stayed in the clearing, playing a tense game of touchball with Leo. Even then, Barnaby wouldn't leave my side, his hackles permanently raised like a row of stiff needles. Every time the wind shifted, He'd snap his head toward the deep brush and let out a single, sharp woof that ended in a whimper. The sun hadn't even set when the temperature plummeted, forcing us back inside the cabin earlier than planned. I was in the small kitchen area, heating up some stew, when the first slam happened. It wasn't a knock and it wasn't a branch falling. It was a violent, structural impact against the back wall of the cabin that made the copper pots on the rack scream. The whole building shuddered, and the framed photo on the mantel tipped over and shattered. Sarah screamed and Leo scrambled behind the sofa, his eyes wide with a terror no 10-year-old should know. "What the hell was that? A bear?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling as she clutched Leo's shoulders. I didn't answer. I grabbed the mag light and the 9mm, my knuckles white against the grip. Then came the second slam, this time against the heavy oak front door. The wood groaned, the hinges straining under a force that felt like a battering ram. It was deliberate, rhythmic, and terrifyingly powerful. A loud bang, the dust shook down from the ceiling rafters. Another one. Barnaby retreated to the farthest corner under the dining table, showing his teeth in a snarl that was more fear than fight. I moved to the window, keeping my body low, and risked a glance through the blinds. I didn't see a face, but I saw a massive, fur-covered shoulder, matted with mud and pine needles, pulling back for another strike. The creature wasn't trying to hide anymore. It was testing the integrity of our shelter. I realized then that a cabin in Maine is just a wooden box, if the thing outside wants in badly enough. "Get in the bedroom, now! Lock the door and stay under the bed," I barked at them, the dad voice taking over despite the static in my brain. As they scrambled away, I heard a new sound, a long, wet rasping against the window pane, like a sandpaper tongue licking the glass. It was followed by a series of scratches high up, near the top of the frame. Whatever this thing was, it was tall enough to reach the eaves without even trying. I stood in the center of the dark living room, the smell of wood smoke and old grease filling my nose, waiting for the wood to give way. The slamming stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt like it was pressing on my eardrums. Then, from just outside the tin log walls, I heard it, a perfect, chilling imitation of a human whistle, low and melodic, drifting through the cracks in the wood. That whistle, it wasn't bird-like, it was human, a three-note melody that sounded like someone calling for their dog. It was the most unnatural thing I've ever heard, a mockery of us, coming from a throat that wasn't built for music. My own skin crawled so hard I thought it would slide right off my bones. I didn't fire. I knew if I started shooting through the walls, I'd just be poking a hornet's nest with a toothpick. "Silvester?" Sarah's voice came in a panicked whisper from behind the bedroom door. "What is it? Is someone out there?" I couldn't tell her it was a thing that could mimic a person. I just told her to stay quiet and keep Leo down. For the next 4 hours, we were under siege. It didn't slam again, but it circled. I could hear the heavy crunch thud of its footsteps on the needles, moving from the front porch to the back window, then up against the side of the house where the kitchen was. Every few minutes, it would drag its claws across the logs. A slow screeching sound like a nail on a chalkboard that set my teeth on edge. Barnaby was a mess, shaking so hard his tags were jingling, his face buried in a pile of laundry. Then, the wind outside died down completely, and the temperature in the cabin seemed to drop 10 degrees. A howl ripped through the night. Not the long, mournful cry of a timber wolf, but a jagged, screaming roar that started deep and ended in a series of sharp, bark-like huffs. It was so close, the glass in the windows rattled in their frames. And then, from further off in the woods, maybe a half-mile east, another one answered. Then another from the west. My heart hit my ribs like a trapped bird. They weren't just curious, they were communicating. I'm a mechanic. I look at the problems and find the point of failure. The point of failure here was the cabin. It was a stationary target, and we were being surrounded. I realized we couldn't wait for morning. If they decided to come through the roof or the windows all at once, we were done for. I crept into the bedroom and found Sarah and Leo huddled together. "We have to leave," I whispered, the urgency in my voice cutting through their shock. "The truck is 20 feet from the door. We go on my signal." Sarah looked at the 9mm in my hand and then at the dark window. "Silvester, it's pitch black out there." "I know," I said, checking my spare mags and grabbing the failing axe. "But if we stay here, we're just waiting for the door to break." I went to the kitchen and grabbed every flare I had in my emergency kit, the bright phosphorus ones I keep for roadside breakdowns. I cracked the first one, and the room flooded with a violent flickering red light. The hissing sound was loud, but I needed the distraction. I opened the front door, just a crack, the red smoke billowing out into the main night. The creature was there, perched on the hood of my truck like a gargoyle, its amber eyes glowing in the red glare. It bared its teeth, rows of jagged white needles, and let out a hiss that sounded like steam escaping a radiator. I didn't think, I just leveled the pistol and fired 2 shots into the air. The bangs were deafening in the small clearing, and the muzzle flashes momentarily blinded me. But the creature shrieked and leapt off the truck, disappearing into the darkness of the pines. "Now, go, go, go," I yelled, the adrenaline turning my voice into something unrecognizable. Sarah and Leo bolted for the truck, Barnaby practically flying off the porch in a blur of gold fur, his survival instincts finally overriding his fear. I followed right behind them, sweeping the red-lit clearing with the felling axe in one hand and the 9mm in the other, my eyes darting toward every shadow that seemed to move. The red phosphorus smoke from the flare hung low in the cold air, creating a hellish, hazy corridor to the vehicle. I heard a heavy movement to my left, a brush of fur against metal, and I didn't wait to see what it was. I threw the burning flare toward the sound and heard a startled yelp as the creature retreated from the heat. We piled into the truck, the door locks clicking into place with a sound that felt like the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard. I jammed the key into the ignition, praying the cold Maine night hadn't sapped the battery. The engine turned over, once, twice, and then roared to life with a mechanical growl that signaled our defiance. As I slammed the shifter into reverse, a massive hand, if you can call something with 4 12-inch talons a hand slammed onto the windshield, spider-webbing the glass right in front of my face. I didn't look at the face behind the glass, behind the claws. I just floored it. The truck lurched backward, throwing the creature off the hood, and they swung the wheel around, the tires screaming as they fought for traction on the loose gravel. I switched on the high beams and the off-road light bar I'd installed last summer. The woods lit up like midday, and for a fleeting second, I saw them. Not just one, but 3 of them, standing on the edge of the road, their muscular, grey, furred bodies hunched and ready to spring. One of them lunged, its shoulder clipping the side mirror and snapping it off like a dry twig. But I didn't slow down. We tore down the dirt track at 40 miles an hour, dangerous for those turns, but staying was certain death. I didn't stop until we hit the paved state road, and even then, I didn't let off the gas until we saw the fluorescent lights of a 24-hour gas station 20 miles south. We pulled into the lot, the truck covered in deep gouges and windshield shattered, and we just sat there in the silence of the idling engine, the 4 of us, shaking. Barnaby was curled in a ball on the floorboards, and Leo was crying silently in the back seat. I walked around the truck and saw the marks, deep, parallel furrows in the heavy gauge steel of the door panels, and the tuft of coarse, black hair caught in the door handle. We didn't go back for our stuff. I called the rental agency from a motel in Bangor and told them there had been a wildlife incident and to keep the deposit. The drive back to Poughkeepsie had the longest hours of my life, every bridge and overpass looking like a place where something could be lurking. I'm back at the shop now, fixing brakes and swapping transmissions. But I don't go hiking anymore. I don't even like being in the backyard after the sun goes down. People ask why I sold my truck and bought a sedan with reinforced glass, or why I keep the exterior lights on all night. I just tell them I'm worried about burglars. But sometimes, when the wind is just right and the neighborhood gets too quiet, I swear I can hear a 3-note whistle coming from the tree line behind my house. And when I look at Barnaby, I see him staring at the door, his hackles rising, and I know I'm not just imagining it. They don't forget a face, and they certainly don't forget the ones that got away.